All right. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that I think a lot of you out there are going to relate to. And that's that feeling when you're learning English and you can understand things pretty well, but then when it comes to actually speaking, it's like hitting a wall. It can be super frustrating.
I do like.
So you guys sent in this awesome podcast episode. It's called Turn Silence into Speaking, Improve Your English Speaking Practice. And it's just packed with good stuff.
It really is. Lots of good advice in there.
Yeah. And so what we're going to do in this deep dive is unpack some of those key ideas and look at some practical steps that you can actually take to get past that hesitation and start speaking English more confidently.
Yeah, I like to think of it kind of like, when you're trying to cook something, you might have all the right ingredients, but actually putting them together into a delicious meal, that can be tricky.
Right, exactly. It's like having the recipe, but not knowing how to actually cook.
Exactly. And this podcast episode does a really great job of breaking down why that putting it all together part can be so hard for English learners. And it gives you some really practical tools to help you get started.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the why for a second. Why is it that even when we understand a decent amount of English grammar and we have a pretty good vocabulary, why does actually speaking it fluently feel like such a huge leap?
Right.
The podcast really focuses on a couple of main reasons.
Yeah. One of the really interesting things that the episode points out is this idea of fear being like this almost invisible barrier. It's not just about gaps in our knowledge. It's often this underlying anxiety, right?
Yeah.
About making mistakes, about people judging us, or even just not being able to find the right words when we need them. And this fear, it can be surprisingly powerful in keeping us from speaking up.
It's like that little voice in your head that's just waiting for you to mess up. And the podcast had this analogy that I thought was really good, comparing speaking to a muscle.
Oh, yeah.
You can read all about how to lift weights, right? But if you never actually pick up a weight and start lifting, you're not going to get any stronger.
Exactly.
And it's the same with speaking.
You got to use it or you lose it.
Exactly.
Ew.
So true. Gotta use it. Okay, so, we've got this fear thing, and then there's also the lack of practice. So what are some practical first steps that the podcast suggests for overcoming this, initial inertia, both the fear and the lack of practice?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that the podcast emphasizes is this idea of shifting how we think about mistakes. So instead of beating yourself up every time you make a mistake, the advice is to see those mistakes as valuable feedback, almost like little signposts that point you toward areas where you can improve.
Right. I love that.
Yeah, it's a much more forgiving and ultimately more effective way to learn.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that can be a really hard mindset shift for people.
Oh, absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in that feeling of oh, I messed up. I'm not good at this. But if you can really shift that thinking to, okay, this is an opportunity for me to learn, then it becomes so much less daunting.
Totally. Every time you make a mistake and someone corrects you or you realize it yourself, that's a learning moment solidified.
Totally.
That's a chance for you to refine your understanding and get a little closer to sounding more natural.
Exactly. Mistakes are just part of the process.
Yeah.
And they can actually be really helpful.
Absolutely. And then on a more practical level, the podcast suggests starting really, really small. Don't worry about trying to have these complex debates or anything right away. Just focus on simple sentences.
Yeah, keep it simple.
Everyday topics, describing what you did that morning or talking about your favorite hobby.
Right, things like that. Just basic stuff to get you started.
Yeah, even just practicing basic introductions.
Exactly. It's all about building that foundation, building that confidence with manageable chunks of language.
Yeah. You wouldn't try to run a marathon without warming up first, right?
Exactly. And, another thing the podcast really stresses is the importance of consistency. Making speaking a daily habit, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes, is going to be way more effective than having these longer less frequent sessions.
Right. It's about building that muscle memory.
Exactly. It's that regular practice that really helps to build that speaking muscle over time.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got this mindset shift, and we've got the start small, be consistent principles. Now, the podcast goes into some really specific daily exercises that you can actually incorporate into your routine. And the first one that stood out to me was the shadowing technique. Can you explain to our listeners how that works?
Sure. The shadowing technique is basically this. You listen to a native English speaker. It could be from a podcast, a news clip, a movie, whatever, and then you immediately repeat what they say, almost like you're their shadow.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And the key here is to try to not just mimic the words, but also their pronunciation, their intonation, which is like the music of their voice, how it goes up and down, and the rhythm of their speech. It's a fantastic way to train your ear and your mouth to work together and to really internalize the sounds of English.
I love that. It's like you're kind of rewiring your brain to the natural flow of the language.
Exactly. You're getting used to the sounds and the patterns of spoken English, which can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Okay, and another technique that the podcast talks about is thinking in English.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty straightforward, but I imagine it's actually kind of a big mental shift for a lot of people.
Oh, it definitely is.
Yeah.
It's about trying to form your thoughts directly in English rather than thinking in your native language and then translating.
Right.
The podcast suggests starting with really simple thoughts, like everyday things, like noticing that you need to buy groceries or that you're feeling tired, and consciously trying to frame those thoughts in English. Even those little internal dialogues can make a difference over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about building that direct connection between your thoughts and English.
Exactly.
Cool. And the podcast also highlights the value of storytelling practice.
Oh, yeah. Storytelling is great.
How does just telling stories in English contribute to better speaking skills?
Well, when you tell a story, even if it's just about something that happened to you yesterday, you're forced to organize your thoughts in English, use connecting words, and practice different verb tenses.
Right.
You're basically rehearsing how to express yourself in a more extended and coherent way, which helps build confidence for longer conversations.
So it's not just about individual sentences. It's about actually building a narrative.
Exactly. It's taking those individual pieces and putting them together into a more complex structure, which is a great way to practice fluency.
Yeah, I like that. And then there's role-playing conversations.
Oh, yeah. Role-playing can be fun.
I like that one because it feels like a really low-pressure way to prepare for real-life interactions.
Totally. It's about imagining common scenarios, like ordering food at a restaurant, checking into a hotel, asking for directions, and practicing what you might say in those situations.
Right.
And the podcast makes a good point about thinking about both sides of the conversation.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, not just what you would say, but what the other person might say and how you would respond. It helps you to think on your feet and anticipate the flow of a real interaction.
That's cool. So it's not just memorizing phrases. It's actually about engaging with the language in a simulated practical context.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, and the last specific daily exercise that the podcast mentions is recording yourself.
Ah, yes.
Which I think can be a little intimidating for some people.
It can be a little scary at first, but it's a really valuable tool. By listening back to yourself, you can hear things that you might not notice when you're just speaking. You can identify areas where you might want to improve your pronunciation, notice any filler words you use, and assess the overall clarity of your speech.
Yeah, it's like getting an outside perspective on your own speaking.
Exactly. And, it can be really helpful to, focus on one specific thing each time you listen.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So one day you might focus on your pronunciation, another day on your grammar, and so on. It makes it feel less overwhelming.
Yeah, that's a good tip. Okay, now a very common challenge, which the podcast addresses, is what to do if you don't have someone readily available to practice speaking with.
Right.
What practical advice does the podcast offer for those situations?
Yeah, this is a big one, right? Because not everyone has a language partner to practice with.
Totally.
One simple but effective technique is just talk to yourself.
Okay.
You can do this in front of a mirror, which can help you get comfortable with seeing yourself speak and also allows you to, observe your body language.
Right. That makes sense.
Another good strategy is to use voice recording apps in a more interactive way.
Oh, okay. How so?
So, for example, you could ask yourself a question in English and then record your answer, like you're having a conversation with yourself.
That's a really clever idea.
Yeah, it's a good way to simulate a real conversation. And of course, the podcast also talks about how technology can be a huge help.
Yeah.
There are AI-powered chatbots that can give you basic conversational practice, online language exchange platforms where you can connect with other learners, and even social media groups where you can find people to chat with.
Yeah, there are so many resources available now.
Absolutely. The point is, you don't need to have a physical speaking partner to make progress. There are plenty of ways to practice.
Right. It's really leveled the playing field in a lot of ways.
Definitely.
Okay, now, the podcast makes this really important distinction, which I think is key, and that's that just having a large vocabulary doesn't automatically make you a fluent speaker.
Right.
What does the podcast suggest to bridge that gap?
Well, this is where the idea of sentence chunks comes in.
Okay. What are those?
These are basically ready-made phrases or groups of words that native speakers use a lot.
Oh.
Things like, that reminds me of, or I think that. By learning these chunks, you can retrieve them quickly in conversation, which reduces hesitation and makes you sound more fluent.
So it's about having these pre-assembled building blocks ready to go.
Exactly. It's like having a toolbox full of useful phrases that you can use in different situations.
I love that. It's not just about knowing more individual words. It's about knowing how to put those words together effectively.
Exactly. Another piece of advice that the podcast gives, which might seem counterintuitive, is to slow down.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, a lot of learners think that speaking faster will make them sound more fluent, but often it's the opposite.
Okay.
Speaking slowly and clearly gives you more time to think, pronounce words accurately, and ultimately communicate more effectively.
That makes sense. And I think it can also make you feel more confident.
Absolutely. It shows that you're in control of your speech.
Okay, let's talk about those little verbal pauses that we all use, the and The podcast offers some strategies for minimizing those.
Yeah, those filler words can be tricky. The most effective approach is to try to replace them with a pause.
Just silence.
Yeah, just a brief silence. It gives you a moment to gather your thoughts without disrupting the flow of your speech.
Okay, I like that.
And the podcast also suggests practicing more structured ways to start your sentences.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
So instead of saying, well, I think, you can say something like, in my opinion, or from my perspective. It gives you a little more time to think and makes you sound more confident.
Those are good tips.
Huh.
Okay, and finally, the podcast talks about something that I know is a concern for a lot of learners, and that's pronunciation and accents.
Right.
What's the main message from the podcast on that?
The podcast emphasizes that having an accent is totally normal and acceptable.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The focus should be on clear pronunciation, not on trying to eliminate your accent entirely.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Yeah, and the podcast recommends practicing specific English sounds that you find difficult and listening to and mimicking native speakers as much as possible.
So it's about clarity and intelligibility and not about trying to sound like someone you're not.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so if we were to distill the core wisdom from this Turn Silence into Speaking podcast into 3 key takeaways, what would those be?
Well, first, don't be afraid of mistakes.
Yeah.
Embrace them as part of the learning process.
Right.
Second, make speaking practice a daily habit, even if it's just for a few minutes. Consistency is key.
Absolutely.
And third, immerse yourself in English as much as possible. Listen, read, speak, and even try to think in English.
Those are great takeaways. It really highlights that it's the consistent effort and a positive mindset that are the keys to unlocking fluency.
Totally. It's about building that habit and not giving up.
So for you, our listener, here's a final thought. Take a moment to think about what your biggest challenge is when it comes to speaking English.
Yeah, what's holding you back?
Is it fear? Is it lack of practice? Is it something else? And then think about which of the techniques we've discussed you can start implementing today.
There are so many great strategies out there. It's just about finding the ones that work for you.
Because as this podcast so clearly shows, overcoming that initial silence opens up a whole new world of communication, connection, and opportunity.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, that's it for our deep dive today.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.